it's just slowing down now. So there's I'll come on to. I see someone's got their hand raised. I'll just come on to that in a second. But firstly, I'll just welcome everybody to the webinar. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. As I mentioned before, this is entitled Development, Planning and Groundwater Flood Risk. It's hosted by CIWEM Southeastern Branch and the BHS Southeast Regional Group. My name's Lisa Chatterjee. I sit on the committees of both of those groups. I'm also BHS trustee, and I'm a principal hydrologist at JBA Consulting. On the sort of technical QA side of things, I'm being supported today by Daniel Cook, who is the chair of the CIWEM Southeastern Branch and also director at AGEA. We also have our two speakers, Stephen Buss and Fola Ogunyoye, who I'll come on to in a second. So if you could just move on to the next slide, Steve, please. A few bits of housekeeping before we get going. So the webinar is being recorded. Both Steve and Fola are happy to share, so that will go up on YouTube at both CIWEM and BHS after, and the link is there. But if you just go online and Google it, you'll find it. If you are having any technical problems, we ask that you sort of raise your hand and put your technical issue in the chat specifically. That's for any technical problems. Any questions or comments on the content of the actual webinar. So if you've got any questions, that goes in the Q&A. Okay, so we have these two methods of communication: chat for technical problems that you're having accessing the webinar, and any questions for the speakers under Q&A, please. Thank you very much. Questions will come at the end of both talks. So we've got two great talks today, and questions for both speakers will come at the very end. It would really help us if you could say who you're addressing your question to, if possible. Obviously, if it's a very generic question, you can't, that's fine. But if you can mention who it's going to, that would help us as well. The webinar accounts for an hour's CPD, but we don't provide any sort of certificates, and it's not part of any accredited training. Thank you, Steve. Next slide. A little bit about CIWEM. We're a Royal Chartered Professional Body and an independent charity. The CIWEM website is a plethora of information, so go online. There's various routes to membership, lots of things to learn about in terms of the policy, the things we get involved with, the publications we produce. So yeah, as I say, go online. It's all there for you. Next slide, please. Who we are. Our mission is to improve water environmental management for the public. As you can see from the map, we're a global organisation, over 11,000 members. We're a community of practitioners and visionaries working on issues like adaptation and resilience to climate change, enhancing our built environment and improving water security. So that's CIWEM. Moving on. Thanks, Steve. BHS, British Hydrological Society, somewhat smaller outfit, registered charity, also a specialist knowledge society of the ICE, fully run by volunteers. Our purpose is for the public benefit to advance education and research in both the scientific and the applied aspects of hydrology. And that's our website there. So again, go online and you'll see all the events coming up. Just note that if you are going to Google BHS, put in hydrology, because otherwise you'll come across the British Horse Society first. So just a top tip there. All right, thank you, Steve. Next slide. Speakers today. So we have Stephen Buss, who is a hydrologist, sorry, Stephen Buss Environmental Consulting Limited and Chief Scientist at Terra IQ Limited. Steve is a freelance hydrologist with wide-ranging experience in groundwater modelling and risk assessments for groundwater flooding. Over more than 25 years as a consultant, Steve has helped the Environment Agency, water companies, developers and home buyers to understand and manage groundwater flood risk at both strategic and site scales. And on top of that, on contract to Geosmart information, he developed a groundwater flooding risk map of Great Britain and a groundwater flood forecasting system. No easy feat. After we hear from Steve, we will hear from Fola Ogunyoye, who is director at TJ Consultancy Limited, with over 35 years of experience at the interface of flood risk development, planning, people and environment, FOLA carries out studies and delivers solutions that help communities and infrastructure reduce their impacts on the environment, making them more adaptable and resilient to flood risk and climate impacts. I won't go through all FOLA's qualifications there, but I will just point out that FOLA leads on the planning workstream of Project Groundwater, which is a fascinating project. Again, if you Google Project Groundwater, it's well worth it. So thank you very much to both Steve and FOLA today for speaking, and I will pass over to Steve now.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. And thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to talk today about groundwater flooding as a brief introduction, how it works in Southeast England, and move on to my bread and butter, really, which is risk assessments for groundwater flooding, which is really interpretation of groundwater flood mapping, because the reason to do a risk assessment always arises when someone's seen a groundwater flood map, and you have to say whether it does or doesn't happen at that point. We're in the Southeast England, so I am going to focus on groundwater flooding in Southeast England, which is dominantly related to the chalk, so I'll talk about that. There are two types of groundwater flooding in the main: bedrock groundwater flooding and flooding through permeable superficial deposits. We're going to talk about bedrock groundwater flooding mostly today, or I am, because well, I'll show you later, because the dominant mechanism of groundwater flooding in Southeast England is from bedrock. So that happens. Bedrock groundwater flooding happens when there's been long-term recharge, really high, a very, very wet winter. It takes, in some places, it takes, weeks of high rainfall to get a rise of flows in groundwater fed streams. In some places in Hampshire, it takes months after the high rainfall for the actual groundwater flooding to come through. As a consequence of that lag time, groundwater flooding does tend to hang around for bedrock groundwater flooding does tend to hang around for weeks or months after the start. And this is one of the reasons why it's quite significant. So it's born of a regional water table rising as a response to that recharge. And the flooding itself, all right, so there's groundwater emergence, but then there's flooding. And the reason for flooding is that the places that are receiving flooding don't actually have a big enough drainage system. Yeah, there are these lovely villages up on the high downs, which only have, if any, surface water. They have a bit of a trickle in most winters. So they don't have much of a drainage system, or the drainage system that they do have, because it hasn't been used in many years, is blocked, full of shopping trolleys and leaves. So it's a drainage issue as well as a groundwater issue. Where permeable superficial deposit flooding is involved, this is linked to fluvial flooding, okay? So next to a big river, and I do mean a big river like the Thames or the Severn, in their lower reaches, you've got these alluvial floodplains with often permeable superficial deposits within them, and then the rising river level percolates through the banks of the river, and groundwater emerges in depressions on the floodplain that are lower than what you would call the flood defences, that lower than the banks of the river. So you get this groundwater coming up in little pools all over the place. Quite a lot of the time, the groundwater emerges and then the fluvial flood comes and just swamps everything. But you've also got areas where only groundwater has come up, and likewise those areas, they don't drain quite as effectively as the areas which are just affected by the fluvial flooding. So what does bedrock groundwater flooding look like? It looks very clear typically, because it's groundwater. It's been filtered through the through the ground. It's come up. Typically, it's come up through the ground, or it's come up through springs in the stream bed. It's usually pretty gentle, actually. It seeps out of the ground and it just isn't draining away. So you see here, this is an image of this is just off the A35 in Dorset in July 2012. This is really typical of groundwater flooding, quite clear. And often confined to the road, but then if you drive a truck through, you're getting waves. And that happens just with any type of flooding, happens with this type of flooding too. This blocked the road just as everyone wanted to get to Weymouth for the 2012 Olympics. And I think the road was blocked for about a week and was causing all sorts of consternation, but did recede in time. You could classify, it is sometimes helpful to think of groundwater flooding in two ways. There's groundwater flooding, which is literally seeping up out of the ground and collecting in hollows. It could be, that hollow could be a basement, it could be your floor. And there's groundwater flooding, which has collected in a catchment and is now focused along a flow path. Eventually, that type of groundwater flooding, it coalesces into a proper flow path and becomes fluvial flooding downstream. So there's a transition from groundwater to fluvial flood that is a slight confusion in the mapping sometimes because they do overlap. So one of the best documented, I think, instance of groundwater flooding, it's not the most severe. The most severe that is of recent memory was early 2001, but it's not super well documented. The best documented one was April 2014. And this is the Environment Agency's map of where properties and infrastructure flooded up to April 2014. It started, I mean, groundwater flooding, we realized it was going to be a groundwater flooding year in the end of January. I remember being away I was away at half term, and it was it was all kicking off around half term in February. And you see, still going on in April in some places, especially Hampshire. Hampshire's, I'll talk about Hampshire. So this is where it was all going on. And actually, it's a nice map of response times. The blue areas, it has come and gone. And the red areas, it's taken a while to develop and has and is still ongoing, still at the end of April. And the box says likely duration 1 to 3 months. A very significant damage event if your home is saturated for 3 months, which it can be. It was in parts of Hampshire. There were also a number of infrastructure knocked out. I'm thinking in particular of Kenley Water Treatment Works, which was it takes water from a series of boreholes and treats it for public water supply and puts it into the system at London, South London. And that was underwater for, I think it was 3 weeks. And the fire service was there pumping the basement away for all of those 3 weeks. It was a pretty significant event for some infrastructure and water supplies as well. So we compare these. Sorry about the dodgy pie charts now. If we compare the locations with bedrock geology, what we see is a very significant pattern of it almost all happens in chalk. Okay, well, April 2014 was a real strong chalk event. I think the only non-chalk event you can see there, you can see a little bit of green sand to the north, north of the Chilterns, and you can see a big blue circle on the Thames. And the Thames was likely flooding because of huge base flow discharge from the Kennet catchment and from the Chilterns, driving that fluvial flooding in the Thames, which was almost all groundwater in the river. So the chalk, and this is the key. The key thing about the chalk is it starts off. It's quite, it's a solid limestone. It is from the Cretaceous period. It's 80, 90 million years old. It's been buried and baked and mineralized. It's solid. It's then had the alpine tectonic activity, which has folded and fractured the chalk. So there's fractures in the chalk, okay? Water can flow through those fractures and it dissolves out those fractures. Okay, and we've got this feedback loop then, where you've dissolved a bit out of the fracture, you get more flow through it, and you dissolve a bit more out of the fracture. So you develop these in the chalk. We develop these almost karstic flow paths. Often they occur at discrete layers within the chalk as well, which does actually reflect in where the water comes out on a hillside. It might actually come out at specific locations up a hillside. It's not just oozing up through the ground. We get, as I say, we get these layered high permeability systems where the groundwater comes out, but also the infiltration recharge through the soil is initially undersaturated with calcium carbonate, so you get more dissolution at the top of the chalk sequence. So you get more fracture development higher up. This means when the water table rises into these high permeability areas, any more water coming onto the catchment just runs off. Doesn't run off. It runs very quickly through the aquifer across the top of the water table to emerge at some discharge point. So the higher the groundwater level, the flashier the response. Chalk catchments are massive compared to some streams of an equivalent size. And so we get this very large catchments with water not running off, but being very flashy through the aquifer. And that's what causes that groundwater emergence all in one go. So I'm going to move on to mapping. And as I said at the start, risk assessment for groundwater flooding is often about saying why the map's wrong, because the groundwater flood maps are very conservative. So it's important to know how they're developed, and then you can look back and say, right, well, the reason that this particular property is not at risk of flooding is because of the assumptions in the map. A really simple illustration of how groundwater flood mapping was done at the start, and actually quite a lot of the modern maps of groundwater flood risk are still based on this approach. It's simply a comparison of where the winter water table intersects the ground surface. So you start off with those two data sets and bring them together, and then you can look at the map at the bottom. These are groundwater emergent zones, which were developed by Jacobs in 2007. And this is where the high groundwater level intersects the ground surface. Okay. This is the basis of flood risk, of groundwater flood risk mapping, and you can see that flooding does not happen across these massive swathes of land. So we are still very much in highlighting places where flood risk should be considered, groundwater flood risk should be considered. It's not a prediction of where groundwater flooding might actually occur. So looking in a bit more detail, this is what I've plotted here is the GeoSmart groundwater flood risk map, GW5. Okay. It's built in Bedrock. It's built in much the same way as I just described, with a few tweaks. I'm using the GeoSmart map because I've got access to it. I don't have access to the other ones. It's not I'm not particularly finding fault with it over the next few slides because they're all very similar maps when you look at Bedrock, to be honest. So here are the areas highlighted in the groundwater flood risk map in red, orange, and yellow as potentially prone to groundwater flooding, or at least very, very shallow groundwater levels. And highlighted in blue are the areas that actually did experience groundwater flooding in back to 2001, the most severe groundwater flood in this area that's been recorded. So there's a lot of conservatism in this mapping. You can also see how wide the groundwater flood risk zones are in this narrow valley. They are a couple of 100 meters wide in some cases. Might have flooded in those locations in blue, but it didn't flood 100 meters, a couple of 100 meters width of the valley bottom. This is all to do with the lack of resolution of groundwater levels that are being used to compare with the ground level. A nice refinement, and I think groundwater GeoSmart have been using it, and also others have been using them. I know Jacobs have been modeling them. Are emergent zone, taking the emergent groundwater and putting it through a flow model down the valley. And this is a much, much better representation of where groundwater flooding actually happened, and also the scale of it in terms of width in the valley bottom. So this is being developed. That's nice. There's a lot of double counting with fluvial flood maps because, of course, in the floodplain, the winter groundwater level is really close to the ground surface. You're not getting groundwater flooding, it's a river. So you mustn't double count groundwater flooding and fluvial flooding. If something's in a fluvial flood zone, it's flooding, isn't it? It's the river. another issue that I see in particular in planning applications is this areas susceptible for groundwater flooding that was developed by the BGS for the Environment Agency, but it's at a kilometre scale. And it does tend to highlight lots of areas. This is Richmond, right? So we might believe that half of Richmond is at some risk of groundwater flooding on the basis of this map. So very much if you see this area susceptible to groundwater flooding, it's a very, very coarse tool. I'll compare it with the GeoSmart map on this. And even that's, even that is probably quite conservative, but it is bringing in quite nicely the areas at flood risk. I've highlighted in blue where the fluvial flood risk is. And what I want to do finally on these examples is to just highlight that we don't really know, we don't really have the mechanisms, the predictive mechanisms or the estimates of flow to be able to compare high risk of groundwater flooding with high risk of fluvial flooding or high risk of surface water flooding. The language the maths just isn't there to compare the two. So when an insurer or a planning authority say there's high risk of groundwater flooding, it probably isn't as severe as a high risk of surface water or fluvial flooding in the same place. My overriding feeling is that any given property is probably not prone to groundwater flooding. Back in 2007, with those groundwater emergence maps that I showed from Jacobs and BGS put the properties and the maps together and said 1.6 million properties are in these groundwater emergence zones. And yet, in 2014, when we had a pretty severe groundwater flood risk event, only a couple of thousand homes were actually flooded. GeoSmart has gone through insurance industry claims data, and about 3% of homes in the high to medium risk bands of the GeoSmart map, only about 3% of homes actually have experienced groundwater flooding at some time. So it is rare, and even if we have a high risk on a particular property, I would say there's probably a small chance that it does actually experience groundwater flooding. So to wrap up, I'm afraid we have incomplete knowledge about aquifers at the scale of settlements and individual properties. So groundwater flood risk mapping is still at a national scale and a bit generic. The distribution of actual groundwater flooding, the actual experiences of groundwater flooding, can be quite complex and can't be predicted at this regional or national scale. It's less common than the mapping might suggest. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. But for each site where we're trying to understand whether it does or does not, we need to understand how the hydrology interacts with the hydrogeology. My feeling about groundwater flood maps overall is that you can trust the white bits. The bits in between the red bits are you probably do not experience groundwater flooding in the white bits, at least not to the sort of mechanisms that have been modelled. The red bits are an indication only that groundwater flooding might happen in those zones. It's not it's not an indication that groundwater flooding will happen. Okay, that's me done. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. That's really interesting. As I mentioned earlier, we'll address any questions at the end of the two talks. So thank you very much, Steve. We'll pass over now to Fola. So Fola, if you want to switch screens. Yeah, we can see that.
Hopefully I'm sharing the right screen this time.
It's the kind of notes slides version as opposed to the slideshow version.
That's fine. So we need to get that bit sorted. Oh, where is that?
Perfect.
Yeah, so am I sharing the right one now?
Yep, that's fine. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, hello everyone. Steve has been talking about groundwater flood risk. Is quite interesting. It really is the Cinderella, when it comes to all different sources of flooding. And it's the one that really we know least about, is the one we invest least into, is the one that we have no national freely available flood mapping on. We just had NAFRA 2. We shouted about it about a year ago, but it does not include groundwater flooding. So then trying to deal with development planning in that context is a bit of a challenge. That's one of the reasons why Project Groundwater, which I've been leading the planning section on, was actually funded by the Environment Agency alongside. So there's actually 3 projects within the 25 projects which have been delivered as part of the FCRIP program. And basically Project Groundwater is one of them. It's a 6-year project, which really is about starting the final year now. This particular one is around, again, some of the areas that Steve was talking about, the Chiltern Hills, Berkshire Downs, being led by Buckinghamshire Council. This to give the kind of 6 different lead local flood authorities from Hertfordshire, Oxfordshire, Luton, West Berkshire, that kind of area. Again, the areas with quite a lot of chalk, which is a real big problem. So Project Groundwater has actually got quite a number of work streams. Some people have been working on modeling, forecasting, nature-based solutions, resilience, and all sorts of things. Now, what we've been working on is the planning work stream, and that's what the presentation today will be talking about. And the planning work streams aim really is to strengthen the consideration of groundwater in the planning system. And what we're producing is guidance to help improve how groundwater is considered in the planning system in the short term, and a lot of influencing activities today being one of them, really just to improve the knowledge about it, and also to feed into a lot of things that can carry on in terms of national policy and legislation, because of course this project is going to finish in a year's time. Now, some of the big challenges that groundwater has is of its own making. Just its characteristics really does not help. It really limits that. I mean, as been mentioned, the frequency, it doesn't happen as often as, say, some of the other sorts of flooding. So it's not in people's minds. When it happens in particular places, but then it comes and sits there for quite a long time. So it's actually quite disruptive in that sense. It's generally invisible until it pops out, emerges. Even though while it's still underground, it could be causing all sorts of chaos to to underground systems, to pipelines, infiltration and all that, to basements, but people don't really see it. Again, so that invisibility is not helping in terms of, putting it in front of people as well as the government, really. And it's quite complex. It's like trying to use deal with a five-dimensional situation with simple two-dimension. You've got, really, this is the marriage of hydrogeology and hydrology, and it really, it's part of some of the first times where we're bringing those two people together to really think about this, which is something that's not been happening quite a lot. So really, as a result of all this, it's not uppermost in people's minds. As a result of that, it's seen as a low priority for legislation and policy. Methods, I mean, we have very clear methods to deal with a lot of the other flood risk, but there's still no consensus really on how to really do this. For example, I mean, climate change, it affects groundwater in a negative and positive way. There's no consensus actually on whether it worsens it, or doesn't. Even the academia, are on different places on this. So, and we're supposed to develop, do developments which will be okay in terms of flooding for the lifetime of the development, but we don't actually have consensus on climate data. So that's the kind of challenges that we're facing. Now, just to start with responsibility, and I've already seen someone say something about this on the Q&A. Now, DEFRA is a policy lead for flood and coastal erosion risk management, everything overall. So on the other side, the MHCLG is a policy lead for land use and planning policy. They don't necessarily tend to head in the same direction as I found. One is trying to, create resilient places for flood risk, and the other is trying to build developments and actually try to get and they don't always link together. Now, Environment Agency has got strategic oversight for all sources of flooding. In addition to their particular operational, things for sort of sea and river flooding, they have this strategic overview, which requires them to provide things like, national data guidance and support to other RMAs such as the LLFAs and local planning authorities in other areas. And the lead local flood authorities, they have the lead responsibility for managing local flood risk, which includes groundwater. So really it's about, they have powers to carry out work to manage the risk from groundwater. They don't necessarily, again, it's not very explicit that they can actually go and do something with the water while it's still underground to suppress it or things like that. But once it comes down, it's a problem, they can do something about it. And then the bit that's already created a bit of sort of debate in the Q&A, I can say categorically that neither the Environment Agency or the LLFA or water company or anybody has a statutory consulting role within development planning for groundwater flood risk. Now that, whenever I say that, that seems to surprise people. Yes, the Environment Agency, they've got that for rivers and sea flooding. Lead local flood has actually got that for sort of, surface water in major developments, but groundwater, nobody. So we wonder why it sort of falls through the gaps. And, some of the challenges we found when we sort of had a look at all this, is that, yes, while DEFRA is the lead for FCR and MHCLG for policy, they aren't necessarily singing from the same sheet. And, a lot of what the direction that MHCLG and the planning process has been going really is about, we want to create loads and loads of new development. We want to stop things that might slow things down. We want to create this national stuff. And really, a lot of the things that are trying to create more sustainable and resilient places to flood risk, if anything, they're trying to streamline that so that developments can go quicker. And something like groundwater, which is not even on the table a lot, it's not really been helped by that. As I've just said a few minutes ago, there's no statutory consulting for groundwater flood risk in development planning. So we just expect that it might just end up being picked up. The Environment Agency looks at, so groundwater in the context of water resources. The lead local flood, they look at the other local flood risks, and they will definitely talk about groundwater, but they don't have to, and they don't have to contact them about it. And as has been said by Steve, it's the most disruptive because it's the one that stays longest. Now, I'm not equating that to the one that has most risk, but actually we don't know because it's never really been properly assessed. I remember once, say after 2014, when they did a bit of assessment, well, how much might the groundwater pay? But hey, try not to try not to double count with river, which was only the bits around, and it's really not been properly looked at. So we don't know, and because we don't know, of course, effort and money is going to the areas where we already know. And now we've done a lot to surface water. We've done a lot to river and sea, and groundwater still remains that Cinderella. So again, a lot of what we've been doing is highlighting that out there. And some of those characteristics, again, of groundwater I just mentioned, just makes it a challenge to defend against. When it comes out, it can be there for months. The kind of volumes we're talking about can be quite a lot. So it's not something you can just store easily. When you try to defend that, if you put like a flood defense, a wall down, it can easily bypass it or come under. So it's not as easy to deal with, and then of all this, there's a lack of risk mapping, nationally freely available risk mapping and guidance, which means it just isn't been addressed as well, and it's falling through the system. NPPF says that it should be addressed, all sources of flooding, but without the data and all the other stuffs, and a lot of the strategic flood risk assessments, again, pay lip service. So it's just not happening at the moment. So we looked at that, and we're developing guidance at the moment, and we started with some guiding principles, which is going to underpin that. And really, there are 5 of them, and these have got some sub-principles, which is really allowing us to get properly into it. Again, the first one is really about making sure that the requirement to understand and address groundwater flooding is visible. Sometimes they just use the word all the sources, and people don't even think about groundwater. Again, just making sure you can't miss it. Making sure that there's clear governance, so the whole of all the holes, within the whole policy, who's responsible and all that, tightening all those up really, and making sure that there are checklists and all sorts of things. That means that you just do not miss it. You cannot avoid, inadequately considering it. Using best available national and local data information, so to actually understand the risk. Again, as Steve has said, yeah, some of the things out there can be quite conservative, but I'd rather, planning is something that, if we're not sure, it's better to be precautionary, and we continue to sort of look at that. But then once you understand the national data, one then needs to support that by local data, local expertise to really get to where the risk is. And then once you know where the risk is, where it's not low, it's then really about applying a hierarchical approach where you sort of assess, you try to avoid it, because it's not easy to deal with it. So we want to avoid it, we want to adapt our developments to it. We want to try to accommodate it such that the groundwater just comes up and goes down without affecting our development and with it being safe to it. And only as a last resort, we really start trying to, resist it. And we do that, making sure that we don't have adverse impacts elsewhere. Again, this is really important because it's very, very difficult. Unfortunately, at the moment, by the time most people are identifying that there's a problem, is so far down within the development phase that they either ignore it or they just put a stick in plaster, which doesn't really work. Now, I'll just pick up 2 or 3 of these guiding principles, and so how we're sort of taking them forward. In terms of just understanding the risk, really, it's it's really making sure that we actually define groundwater flood as not just when water comes out, but when it's still underground, causing problems to basement and other things. Recognize where it's from, because actually the way groundwater behaves in chalk and permeable sediments and other are slightly different. So it's good to understand what it is so you can actually address it appropriately. At a development scale, really then refining that flood hazard using available local knowledge and data, boreholes, existing water monitoring and things. And if there isn't enough, actually taking a period of time to actually do some monitoring, so that one can understand it better. And this is for areas where it's quite clearly not low. Again, accounting for long-term impacts, we don't know what that is at the moment in terms of climate change, But things like, where there's been a lot of a lot of pumping and cessation of pumping and water when the water levels obviously rising over time, again, that understanding is helpful to bring it into the whole analysis, and really making sure that anything we're doing to other sources of flooding accounts for groundwater and vice versa. Now, again, as been mentioned, looking at the national scale, I mean, these are perhaps some of the available mapping out there, and this really gives a start. As has been said, some of them, the mapping and modeling methodology are quite different. What they actually present, some actually just, it's about where water emerges. Others actually, there's a bit of routine, and so one is to understand what you are actually seeing. The categorization is very different. Some of them use three different classes of risk. Others use 4. Others use 5. The definitions are very different. So you can imagine a planner or a developer trying to use them. It's quite a bit of a challenge. In fact, one of the things we're doing within our project now is trying to come up with a consistent, set of class, again, very broad classes, so that at least we can start looking at something and then seeing how the current ones link to that. So again, making sure that the strategic scale maps. The maps are quite strategic and they might not account for important local data. So again, you then take that to local risk. With again, it's very important. One gets, when you've got a risk, it's best to get some specialist advice involved in it, like a hydrogeologist and things like that, so that you can make sure that you are using, you're actually using the right local knowledge and you're interpreting it well for your development. And if things are so uncertain, then there is a need to do, again, the code of practice also suggests 12 months of groundwater monitoring data. I would say at least at the minimum 6 months, during those sort of, November to sort of May, June type period. Again, recognizing that sometimes, the use of boreholes and things like that, sometimes it's better to have quite a number of them instead of relying on one and things like that. Just things to put in mind when one is trying to get better understanding, because you need to know what the risk is before you can actually do something about it. And whatever the risk assessment says, when you see things like this, it's a winterborne view, winterborne road, spring road, that says something. Whatever the risk says, there is likely to be a problem there. You just need to look a bit deeper. Now, once we know that there perhaps is groundwater flood risk, or there's a likelihood that there is then really, using what we call, trying to make space for the groundwater, and recognizing it's very difficult to defend against. So we really try to avoid it. We try to avoid it if we can, as opposed to, as we're trying to do something about it. If we cannot relocate it away from it, then really we want to be adapting the development as best as possible, with a sequential approach to sort of avoid, the move things to the low hazard area. We want to explore ways by which you can perhaps remove some of that, redirect it away somewhere else, things you can do, take obstructions for winter bonds, but making sure whatever we do does not worsen things elsewhere. And we want to accommodate anything that's remaining, within the development, but making sure that, the groundwater can breathe. Water can come up and down, but it's not actually affecting the development and is designed to be resilient to that. Now, as a last resort, if all of that can happen and the development still has to happen there, then really we're then starting to say, okay, at that point, then maybe you might want to look at some stuff, but it's important when you're looking at that, you need to consider the lifetime of the development. You need to make sure that, you're looking at not just what it's like to go over ground, but underground as well. You need to make sure that whatever you do does not worsen, flood risk elsewhere. And really, you need to make sure that, whatever you're doing for surface water, and groundwater and all that, for example, salts, if you're trying to put salt somewhere and there's going to be high groundwater, is that space going to be there? So again, all those need to be properly thought about. Now, as I say, the key thing we're trying to do with this project is to develop guidance. and to put things out there as much as possible. So some of the things we're already doing. I mean, there's this. We've been working with the Town and Country Plan Association and the Royal Town Plan Institute. They recently, in December, updated the planning for climate crisis, the guide that a lot of local authorities use in terms of planning for flood risk. So a lot of input was put into that in terms of groundwater flood, which was completely absent before. So at least we're putting things across that way. Also, we did a blog in January, to the RTPI website, against getting that message of groundwater flood risk to the planners. So they're thinking about. So we're already starting to put some of those things there. Those are the links. In fact, those three. So that's a link for Project Groundwater if you want more information, and those two others are for the particular information that I've just put there. So that really is the end of my talk, and I'll hand over for questions.
Thanks, Fola. That's great. Yes, so I think, Daniel, have you been overseeing the questions? I think we've got a few, so.
Yeah, thanks ever so much, Steve and Fola, for your presentations this afternoon. I do have a couple of questions which have come through. Conscious of time, we've got 8 minutes, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. In no particular order, Fola, if we could start with yourself. Quite a pivotal question in planning. Given the issues with groundwater flood mapping, what is your opinion on the sequential test being requested for, specifically if it's groundwater flood risk? If the flood mapping of groundwater is flawed, what are the comparative assessments that could be conducted, as it's going to be very difficult?
Well, again, I guess the thing is, while the current information might be a bit on the conservative side, at least comparatively, it allows us to sequentially move to places to lower areas. Now, the high area might really be medium and all that, but at least that allows us to do. More than anything, it's more the fact that at the moment the lack of, if you go into the NPPF and the guidance, there is quite clear things that actually tell you how to apply sequential tests to river and to sea flooding. And some of the things, in fact, groundwater and surface water, some of the recent NPPFs is trying to move those a bit away from sequential tests and back, so you're only dealing with it in terms of the actual flood risk assessment. So I think it still should be done. Of course, there are ways by which you can improve it, but it depends on the scale you are. If you're at the scale of local authority where you're trying to decide which areas to actually build, then I think that conservative way to conserve maps is a good starting point. Obviously, you then use more local information. As you then get to development level, that's the point where you need to start getting more data and making sure you get the right people involved. So that, because the last thing you want is to put in a development and groundwater comes in and it doesn't go, it sits there for ages. No one wants that.
Yeah. No, understood. No, thank you, Fola. And I suppose what ties into that, another question which has come in from Stella. Steve, currently there are a few data sets available in relation to groundwater mapping, BGS groundwater susceptibility, which maps hazard, JBA groundwater flood risk maps, which are probabilistic data set, and EA groundwater alerts derived from levels and alerts. How can we improve on mapping? Wouldn't we need some sort of dynamic modeling to accurately map it? Otherwise, aren't we dealing with approximation only? And would there be scope, in your opinion, and potentially, Fola, over to you as well, to install groundwater monitoring devices at all new developments?
Well, I think groundwater monitoring is a lot more of that is needed. In fact, some of the Project Groundwaters, the one in Lincoln, has put in quite a lot of monitoring in. So yes, modeling is getting better, as Steve said. People are starting to look a bit more. They're looking at the kind of soil. The geologists, hydrogeologists, and hydrologists are starting to talk together. So we're seeing what's happening on the ground better. Then when it comes out, we're then routing them better, and we're starting to link them. So I think that there's a lot of. There was a summit done as part of Project Groundwater, looking into where we are in groundwater and groundwater flooding, and there is a lot of proper research and development that needs to happen. Unfortunately, when I check with the Environment Agency R&D program, there isn't a single project for groundwater flooding. So again, we're putting a lot of effort in this. Also, again, we are pushing the Environment Agency. The next time the new NAFRA comes out, we need to do a lot of work between now and the next one to make sure that groundwater flood is dealt with. Because until we're starting to get this authoritative mapping, then the chances that people will just ignore it.
I suppose, Steve, based on that question and just based on my own knowledge, back in 2019, Dorset have put in monitoring equipment for flood alert and warning services. So how could that potentially, tying into that question from Stella, be sort of broadened into sort of more of a national approach?
Well, I don't know if a national approach is the appropriate way to go, because there are areas which are definitely at risk of groundwater flooding and there are areas which are not. And I don't think Cumbria needs any involvement in it, for example, or the Pennines or much of Wales. I think the local authorities on chalk and on limestones, they could actually support some more detailed modelling using local knowledge and actual incidents of groundwater flooding to improve the scale of the flood mapping. Saying that, I think the national maps with flood routing are a really great step. They're a really great step, but we do need to look at the detail of the geology in a bit more detail than the geology maps in the back of the national maps.
We've got time for just one more question. Just looking at the list, apologies for all of those that we've not been able to answer. We will try and get back to you at the end of the session for those questions raised. They are all monitored. So if you're happy for us to reach out, we will. One question here, just given the time. Does the rate of dissolution of chalk aquifers provide a challenge to modelling of groundwater flood risk in creating new emergence pathways, sort of reduction in lag for infiltration into the aquifer and increased flow rates, or is it such a slow rate that it's not considered too much to be of an issue?
I think that's a brilliant question. I think the chalk has been exposed to weathering and groundwater since the end of the Ice Age. So in terms of the timescales that we're working on, I don't think that new pathways are really being developed at the moment.
Fantastic. Fola and Steve, genuinely thank you ever so much this afternoon. Lisa, handing back over to you now.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for all the questions. As Daniel says, we'll try and send out responses to those we weren't able to answer, given it seems to be a really a topic that's close to many people's hearts, so they have got questions. So if you just, Fola, if you could just flick on, for those who are able to stay on for a couple of slides. Just a couple of shout out for some events that are coming up, both CIWEM and BHS. So they're in April, we've got the Urban Drainage Group Training Day. In May, the Rivers and Coastal Group Early Careers Professional Challenge. And the Flood and Coast Conference in June, which I'm sure a lot of people are already aware of. On the BHS side, we have Emerging Groundwater. Well, this is the CIWEM Urban Drainage Group and the Hydrological Group of the Geological Society. That's hard to say. In May, the Emerging Groundwater and Urban Infrastructure Conference. So that might be of interest particularly for those audience to this call. Drought Hydrology, 50 years since 1976. That's an in-person event in London. That's the ICE. And in September, there's a 3-day event. We're having our BHS Symposium. That's being held at Leeds University. So that's an in-person event as well. All of those events are on the relevant website, CIWEM website and BHS website. So just go on there and you'll find all registration and submission of abstracts and all that information. Is there anything else after that slide, Fola?
That's the last slide.
That's the last slide. Perfect. So once again, thank you to Fola and Steve for a really interesting talk. And thank you to everyone who's attended and for the questions. It's obviously a good topic, and we'll follow it up with probably no doubt another groundwater session soon. So we wish you well. Have a good rest of your day.